You're listening to the ESO Network, your station for all things geek.
Hello, world, and welcome to Tales from Hollywoodland, a veritable feast of movies, television, Broadway, showbiz stories, and even a little bit of news and gossip with Julian Schlossberg, Arthur E. Friedman, and Stephen J. Rubin. Today, we're talking about underrated movies. And now, here's Steve.
Thank you, Mike. I feel like Johnny Carson some days. I just have to swing that. So underrated movies. I think these are movies that were probably somewhat ignored by the critics. They didn't get a lot of the fanfare, perhaps, that we associate with hit movies. But over the years, they've either established themselves as cult hits or movies that we appreciate a lot more now than we did then. Or it's sometimes a case of finding a little movie that got no attention, that when people say, can you recommend a good movie? You say, oh, you got to see this movie. In going through, and literally we could talk for days on these movies, one of my favorite little discovered movies, and I'm not sure if this got enough attention, this goes back to 1983, so we're talking 41 years ago. Peter Riegert starred in a little movie called Local Hero. Do you guys know it?
Yeah, yes. Bert Lancaster.
One of Bert Lancaster's last movies. Peter Riegert plays this he's an oil executive from Houston, very successful, drives a Porsche, has the apartment, the girly pad for all the girls, and he's sent on a mission to buy a little village. And I think it's Scotland. It's on the coast of Scotland, or is it Ireland? I can't remember.
I thought it was Scotland, but I may be wrong.
I think it was Scotland. Anyway, he has to buy this village because they're going to put in a big oil platform and center for distribution. And the story is about him and his associate, who is a Brit, and they discover the charm of this little coastal village. And there's a little magic involved in it and the people they meet. And I was completely charmed by this movie. And I got to work with Peter Riegert much later, and he was a big fan of the movie as well. He was in my Bleacher Bums movie that we made in 2001. And I thought it was a great movie. What did you guys think?
I liked it a lot. I thought it was interesting to see Bert Lancaster at the end of his life doing a solid job as he always did. It nearly never did business, but it was a good little movie. I agree with you.
We did business in little art theaters, Julian. The more intelligent public liked it. There's another Bert Lancaster movie, speaking underrated, called Rocket Gibraltar. You guys remember the movie?
Yes. I remember the title.
Wonderful little film that happened to have Jim Paxton and Kevin Spacey at the beginning. Terrific movie. Lancaster was just great in the film. Lancaster made another thing called Atlantic City. I don't know if you can call it underrated, but it's a hell of a movie.
Yeah, that was a Louis Malle film with Susan Sarandon, and I think it did some business. It certainly got good reviews. We know that. Which leads me to a movie that didn't get good reviews from the top critics, that I opened in New York to launch the movie at Christmas time at the Coronet Theater. If the four of us went to the Coronet at Christmas time, we would have done more business than Harold and Maude did. It was amazing. Harold and Maude, this wild love story, Ruth Gordon playing this hip, sophisticated woman, and Harold, this young kid who wants to commit suicide, and Vincent Canby massacres it, Roger Ebert massacres it, and we do no business. We have to take it out in 2 or 3 weeks. But all across the country, slowly but surely, like the turtle and the hare, this movie continues to play in major cities. 3 years in Minneapolis. It plays in the same theater. In St. Louis, in Montreal, and Arthur, What happened in your town?
Booked into a theater called the Central Square Theater in Cambridge, at 150 seats, with a double feature. The second feature was King of Hearts.
Alan Bates.
A little movie. And played for 8 years. I repeat, 8 years.
My God. Wow.
Yeah.
Now, wait a second. Now, let me get this straight. This movie played in one of your theaters, and you didn't change the movie for 8 years?
8 years, because the amount of business we did weekend after weekend after weekend was the same.
So it was kind of like the version of Rocky Horror.
Yeah, in a way, a different kind of film.
No, but Rocky Horror was playing at midnight. This was playing 7 days a week.
Yeah.
Wow.
You know.
That's unbelievable.
Speaking of Ruth Gordon, I guess I wasn't content enough to go with one Ruth Gordon failure. I then put in another film, another black comedy with Ruth Gordon called Where's Papa?
Yeah.
And Where's Papa, again, did not do business, and it is one of the funniest black comedies you'd ever want to see. George Siegel, Trish Vanderveer.
Ron Liebman. I mean, it's really funny. Carl Reiner directed it, and if you look closely, in the courtroom scene in Where's Papa, his then daughter-in-law, Penny Marshall, is sitting there watching the courtroom. At that point, she was married to Rob Reiner. Now, here's the thing. Where's Papa is that Ruth Gordon continues to tell her son that she thinks he's Papa. She doesn't know his son, et cetera, et cetera. And the screenings take place. And when I had the first screening of it with the public, the ending was so bizarre that even the United Artists had to take out the ending. The original ending was that Ruth Gordon has been put in a home, old folks' home, and George Siegel is going to visit his mother, and she consistently says, "Where's Papa? Where's Papa?" And the end of the movie originally was, he says, "He's here," and he gets into bed with her. That's right.
But that, they couldn't, even that. I remember David Picker, who was Arthur's boss and the head of the studio, said his mother was infuriated, Sylvia Picker. Do
you know, guys, that they decided incredibly to originally sneak preview the picture in Miami Beach to an audience of a lot of older cockers, and the entire audience, by the time the movie ended, walked out. David Picker said this was the worst decision I've ever made, but they did it. Funny movie. Some scenes in that movie were
fantastic. I thought it was funny as hell. But those are the two films that I think were the most disappointing to me as an exhibitor years ago, because I really thought I was coming up, and I think we were, with some hip movies, but it was, as Charles Grodin once said, too smart for the room.
Yeah.
You
mentioned Julian, looking in the courtroom, you could see Penny Marshall. A little trivia: there's a terrific movie that Sidney Lumet did called The Verdict.
Yes,
and if you
that was a hit.
If you look at the courtroom, non-speaking role, but he's just there. You're going to see, before he became anything, a guy named Bruce Willis in the courtroom in The Verdict.
No kidding.
Really?
Check. But that's not an unknown. That's not a.
That was a hit. That was one of Sidney Lumet's greatest movies and one of Paul Newman's greatest acting of all time.
So I was working for a company called Scotty Brothers Pictures back in '88, and we were opening a movie called The Iron Triangle in Norfolk, Virginia, for a test market. Now, Iron Triangle is not the movie I want to talk about. It was a good little Beau Bridges Vietnam War picture with Hang Nor, who had recently won the Oscar. And I went out to a sneak preview in a local Plex, and I saw a John Carpenter movie called They Live. And They Live was a really interesting idea. It stars a wrestler named Rowdy Roddy Piper. Now, Rowdy Roddy Piper, I had no idea who he was, but he was very charismatic. And he plays kind of a drifter who comes to L.A., gets a little construction job, and discovers something weird going on in the neighborhood. So a series of events, they clear this homeless encampment where he's been living, and he follows one of the guys who's been running the camp and finds a box of sunglasses. He puts on the sunglasses, and every fourth person he sees on the streets is an alien. And they've taken over the earth. They're mining the earth of all its natural resources, and they're recruiting humans to be part of this massive conservative wave. It's actually a fascinating movie that Universal literally dumped.
Yes.
I mean, these glasses are funny because you look up at a billboard without the glasses, Julian, and you see a commercial for a new Pontiac. But you put the glasses on and it says, obey.
Mm-hmm.
And you go to another billboard, and instead of it showing a vacation in Miami, it has a thing, do not think, things like that, which to me would have inspired a great nationwide ad campaign. Because Rowdy is terrific. He can't convince anybody that what's going on because nobody has the glasses. This underground group headed by this guy running the homeless area is running this. And Keith David plays one of his fellow construction workers. He's asking him to put on the glasses, and Keith David doesn't want to do it. So they get into what arguably is the longest bare knuckles fist fight I've ever seen in my life. They pound each other for about 5 minutes.
It's such a wonderful film. It is
you know it, Mike.
Oh, of course I do. And that's like must-watching stuff at least once a year for me, because even the magazines have subliminal messages in it. If it's a picture like an ad with a sexy woman, if you put the glasses on, it'll say reproduce. And, that type of thing. And it's all over. Even the cash, it even has, when you look at it through the glasses, it says spend me. And so it's just amazing how in control. And the aliens are disguised as humans. And the only way you could tell they're different is with the glasses on. It's a fascinating story.
Did it do business, guys?
It did a little bit. It became more of a cult hit. Probably like 3 years afterwards. And it's actually one of the only movies that Roddy Piper starred in. And he was amazing in this film.
He was amazing. He had for my money, he had the charisma of a Rock or a Schwarzenegger. And then it didn't take, which I don't know why, because he was gritty. He was fun.
Oh yeah. One of the best lines in the world in this movie was, I'm here to kick butt and chew some bubble gum, and I'm all out of bubble gum.
Gordon, I want to go back to Where's Papa for a second. Have you seen it recently?
No, I have not.
I wonder how it would stand today. I haven't seen it in a long time.
I do remember a scene that would never be able to be shot today, which is that a black woman is standing on Central Park West in order to get a cab. And George Segal is in a gorilla outfit. And he comes down and he puts up his hand and the cab passes the black person to pick up the gorilla. Yeah. Okay. And that gives black comedy, I guess, a new meaning. But John Carpenter also made a remake of The Thing, and that was not successful. And that was very surprising. In fact, the reviews were not good, but over the years, it has a very big following. So,
that's also Kurt Russell and Keith David again.
Yeah, and you guys mentioned Carpenter, so that's what made me, think of him.
There's a movie I would say is underrated. Mel Brooks had great success with Blazing Saddles and Young Frankenstein. I'm a big fan of a picture that really never got there successfully called High Anxiety. Some of that movie is great. Maybe not the whole movie, but there are scenes in that film that just are fantastic. Madeline Kahn, who was outstanding in everything she ever did.
Cloris Leachman is amazing in that film as the tragic character. And
Bond is Less Pain, something like that. Yeah. Harvey Korman. That's a little.
We should point out, Arthur, that it was a takeoff on all the Hitchcock movies.
Yes.
and very, very
even they do the
funny at
shower.
times.
They do the shower scene, and a bellboy runs in with the newspaper. Your paper's here. Your paper's here.
Michael, that bellboy was Barry Levinson.
I know, which is
who happened to write that scene. But there's also a scene in that movie where she says her father's in the home because he thinks he's a Cocker Spaniel. And Mel Brooks responds, your father's a cocker? Meaning, that there was this little old guy in the movie. So that's one worth seeing for people who are listening here and never heard of it. High Anxiety stands up as an underrated film. Very funny.
Okay, my first one I got for you guys is from 1996. It's a Tom Hanks movie, actually. He wrote it, and he directed it, and he starred in it. It's called That Thing You Do.
It's about a musical group, right?
Nice movie, yeah.
It's such a wonderful film, and it didn't do well at the box office, but it did really well on home video. And it is a fun movie, and it's one of those things where they play the theme song like 15 zillion times throughout the movie, and by the time you're out of the film, you cannot get it out of your head.
Very catchy song.
Yeah.
Well, that happens at The Princess Bride, for example, was not successful in the theaters, but it became a giant on home video, and of course is considered now one of the best of those kind of movies with a great cast and a lot of fun. I wanted to talk about a terrific comedian who makes movies, and they're never big, but they're always good, and that's Albert Brooks.
Oh, gosh, yes.
Yeah, Albert Brooks made two movies that I love. The first is Defending Your Life, which is such a terrific movie about what happens in the afterlife with Meryl Streep, Rip Torn, Lee Grant, and it is funny and it is very special. And then the second was Lost in America. Arthur and Steve, and we've all talked about that movie before.
The scene in Lost in America where Albert Brooks thinks he's getting a promotion to senior vice president, and he walks into his boss's office and he learns he has to work on Ford and move to New York immediately, is one of the funniest scenes I've ever seen in any movie. I mean, it disintegrates into and Albert Brooks pulls that off so beautifully. There's also the great scene later on where his wife has just taken the family fortune and flushed it down the toilet playing roulette in Las Vegas, and he has to go to Gary Marshall to get their money back. That dialogue is
Gary Marshall's acting. Most people are not aware that acting a lot has to do with making faces. They say Greta Garbo retired because she said, "I'm sick and tired of making faces." But a lot of acting is reacting, and no one did it ever better in that scene than Gary Marshall when he was listening to the spiel by Albert Brooks.
Albert Brooks.
I got a great idea. You give us back our money and you advertise it all over the country that you had heart.
The desert inn has heart. The desert inn has heart. I have chills.
Gary Marshall just sitting there and watching this and saying nothing. And saying, God Almighty!
But I love the way he starts the conversation after they've lost all their money. He sits down with Gary Marshall, and the first thing out of Gary Marshall he says, "I know you had some bad luck tonight. Your room comped."
That's right.
Well, I'm going to bring up a movie that I think I may stump the experts on. I'll find out. Certainly, I've been stumped on Roddy Piper or whatever his name is, but today. But I saw a movie. I launched it in New York called Me, Natalie. What do you think? Ever hear of it?
I've heard of it. But I have no idea what it is.
Yeah, it was with Patty Duke was the star of it. Guy named James Farentino was the co-star. Fred Coe, a very well-known director, directed it. A story about an unattractive girl in New York City, how she gets by. And the very first movie that ever he made was Al Pacino in Me, Natalie.
Oh, wow.
So it has that pedigree at least. But it was a lovely movie, and I opened it, and it did not do well, but You know, it's a film
Did Putney Swope have success? Robert Downey
Oh,
Sr.
yes, because of Don Rugoff's ad campaign.
Yeah.
Remember, it was the middle finger was put up in the air, and a girl was on top of that finger.
Yeah.
And, it did extremely well in some cities. It wasn't a huge movie, but it was big for, as you said earlier, Arthur, the art circuit. You know, when there was an art circuit.
How about the little graphic logo for MASH? Speaking of the fingers,
fantastic.
Is that great?
Great, yeah. But I'll tell you the story about MASH, because I launched it also in New York, was the fact that we had a sneak preview of MASH, and what Arthur talked about the audience emptying in Miami, people in New York were running out because it was so bloody. There was the operations that Altman had shown in the original movie that no one's ever seen, except that audience and myself, was really bloody. And so they cut that down. There's still plenty of blood floating around, but nowhere near what it originally was. And then it became that big hit. We had the same thing when I was at Paramount with Marathon Man. Had a sneak with, and that dental scene, is it safe? Is it safe? People were freaking out on the dental scene. So while again, what the public saw was was completely cut down, not somewhat cut down, still in there, still pretty tough, but much, much less. So,
speaking of Robert Altman, I was in Toronto in '92, and I remember going to the theater to see The Player.
Oh, yes.
I thought was one of the
wonderful.
one of the great portraits of how Hollywood works, but also disguised in a little bit of a dark, a dark incident that involves the death of a screenwriter. I was mesmerized by that movie because I think that, well, first of all, Robert Altman assembles arguably one of the largest celebrity casts ever to play themselves in parties and restaurants. And it's all about this studio executive named Griffin Mill, played beautifully by a fairly new Tim Robbins. And he, just the way the studio operates and how people come in and pitch new movies. I think there's a scene where somebody's pitching the sequel to The Graduate. It was the screenwriter. I can't forget the screenwriter's name. You know who it is. But he also co-wrote, I think co-directed Heaven Can Wait with Warren Beatty. But Buck Henry's pitching the sequel to The Graduate. Thank you, Julian. And that was an interesting movie. Greta Scacchi, I believe, plays the key leading lady.
Oh, that was a first-class quality film. The Player. It did business, as I recall, $25 million domestic. In those days, that was a hit, which is the same amount of box office, by the way, at that time, of a movie called Shawshank Redemption. Could only do $25 million. Then Redford comes out with a movie called Quiz Show, which I worked on with him, overseeing distribution, and we did $25 million. So I said to him one day, I think there's $25 million worth of intelligent Americans. That's
what funny, because the James Bond movies, we all know how successful they've been over the years, perhaps the most successful franchise ever. And the lowest number they had was for the sixth film, which made $25 million, on Her Majesty's Secret Service, starring George Lazenby, who was tasked with filling the shoes of Sean Connery, which of course was impossible. But I will tell you, having seen this movie multiple times since, that On Her Majesty's Secret Service may be the best directed film in the series, just in terms of the way it's shot. Because
terrific movie.
Peter Hunt was making his directing debut. He had edited the first 5 James Bond movies. So his reward from Broccoli and Saltzman was to get the directing chair. And it is such a carefully produced movie, maybe one of the closest to Ian Fleming's original novel than any of the Bond movies. And Lazenby, there's a whole story about Lazenby. He only did the one movie, but for an actor who had zero acting experience, who bamboozled his way into an interview with Albert Broccoli, claimed he had made a lot of films in Eastern Europe, and this was pre-internet. They couldn't check on that kind of stuff. And he got the job. Physically, he was perfect, but he had no experience whatsoever.
So you're saying, Steve, that it's an underrated Bond movie. Is that right?
Underrated Bond movie.
Yeah.
It's an underrated movie.
It has one of the best themes of all the things.
Well, John Barry did the music.
Right.
The signature was the only movie that has a instrumental title song.
Yep.
The song that they actually prepared for the movie, it was one of the last songs sung by Louis Armstrong. It's called "We Have All the Time in the World." But
Exactly.
it was too slow.
We have all the time in the world.
Yep.
Not bad. Hey, I want to
Louis
go back
lives.
to the genre.
Louis lives.
Yeah, right.
I want to say, Arthur, you said the Shawshank Redemption.
Yes.
I would say in the history of movies, it's one of the worst titles for the public I've ever heard. Makes no sense. You don't know what it is.
No, that's right.
On top of it, the brilliant minds of the advertising decided, let's not use Stephen King's name.
Right.
I mean, I'll never understand that.
The original
word of mouth conquered that movie. Word of mouth.
It did, but it was
title,
but it needed time, and it took a lot of time for it to become the successful film it is.
The original title was the story that King wrote called Rita Hayworth and the Shawshank.
That's right. Yes.
Which probably
they
would have
actually
been better.
shortened it.
But I think you're absolutely right, Julian. I have a theory that on Friday nights, when the families decide what they want to see, they got to be able to pronounce the title first. And
know what it means second.
Exactly. Shawshank. I mean, there's such a kind of a study that can be done on the effectiveness.
Well, there's always Kaleidoscope. That was a great title.
Well, how about Mel
Just
Brooks?
kidding.
Mel Brooks, we've talked about his genius for years now.
I know.
He came out with a title called Life Stinks.
And that's what the critics said.
Listen, Steve, I want to go back to that genre you're talking about with The Player, which was a first-class movie, well-made, terrific movie. Not a big hit, but nonetheless. But there was another little movie in that genre at the time called The Big Picture.
Oh, yes.
Which didn't really do much business and is definitely underrated because in that movie, Marty Short gives one of the great performances ever as an agent in the business. And Marty's funny. I mean, he's just...
it's hysterical. I mean, Kevin Bacon plays the lead, and if you haven't heard of The Big Picture, he's the neophyte young filmmaker who comes to Hollywood to make his bones, and you follow him on his journey, and it's a wonderful movie. I agree.
Yeah, but underrated. Didn't really get out there. I want to mention a movie.
Oh, go ahead.
Thank you. There was a very great movie in the 1950s called Executive Suite.
Yeah.
Bill Holden, Louis Calhern. What a great movie.
Paul Douglas.
Oh, yeah, everybody in this movie was fantastic. Barbara Stanwyck. Who directed it? You know, anybody offhand? Great movie.
Oh, I loved it. I thought it was too.
I don't know who directed it offhand. However,
I don't know.
I'll have that answer in 30 seconds.
At the same time, there was a little black and white movie called Patterns, which was similar.
Everett Sloan.
Ed Begley.
And by the way, it was from a television show.
Right.
The television show was first, and then they made the movie.
Will you agree? Great movie?
Terrific.
Yeah.
Written by Rod Serling.
Ooh.
Oh yeah.
And it's in fact, he won the Emmy for the original teleplay, one of 3 Emmys he received in live television. By the way, Executive Suite was directed by Robert Wise.
Yeah, it's not even going to guess that.
Great. Now, speaking of Robert Wise, that's a nice transition for me because I wanted to mention a movie that I think was the best picture of 1966, but fell into the shadow of A Man for All Seasons, the great Paul Scofield history lesson, which got all the awards that year. But this was a movie called The Sand Pebbles.
Oh, yes.
Sand Pebbles arguably was probably Steve McQueen's best performance. His only Oscar nomination was for that movie. He played a seaman in 1926 China named Jake Holman, who's assigned to the San Pablo, which is a gunboat on the Yangtze River of China during that period. And the Chinese people have a little nickname for the ship. They call it the Sand Pebbles.
Hardly underrated, though.
Well, I think that it gets dismissed a lot in the wake of A Man for All Seasons and other films of that period. I think that it is a terrific movie, and in any given year probably would have won Best Picture. But
they had one of the great soundtracks, great themes by Jerry Goldsmith, I believe.
Jerry Goldsmith, absolutely, and had a wonderful supporting cast. In fact, Mako was one of the actors. The Japanese actor Mako was in it. Simon Oakland was in it. Richard Crenna, Candice Bergen.
Hey, Candy Bergen.
Candice Bergen. Absolutely.
There was another movie that came out at the time, which was a success. It's hard to call it underrated, but it is underrated in the scheme of movies for all time. Norman Jewison made a movie in 1965 or 6 called The Russians Are Coming, during the Cold War. And I'm telling you guys that movie stands up today. It works. Theodore Bickel, Carl Reiner, his family.
But Alan Arkin steals the movie.
Alan Arkin stole the movie. Ben Blue was in that movie. Whoever would remember who that was. What a fun film, and had emotion. Really had emotion. It was terrific. Norman Jewison, one of his best works. I would call that a bit underrated.
Yeah,
I saw it for the first time last month. And it was my film. It was my classic film review last month, and I loved it. I thought it was terrific. It's what I call a chaos comedy, kind of in the same genre as It's a Mad, 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 Mad World, 1941, etc. Now, speaking of Spielberg, Paul Ford, absolutely. Spielberg movies get a lot of attention. I mean, since the Sugarland Express, every movie has been a major story. But one movie that's been kind of a little bit forgotten is my favorite Steven Spielberg movie, 1987, Empire of the Sun, featuring a young boy named Christian Bale, who obviously has become a big star since. He plays the young lead who, if you haven't seen the movie, he's a British kid. His family lives in, it's in Shanghai, China, pre-Pearl Harbor. Everything seems kind of calm until it doesn't. And he is separated from his parents in the craziness of the Japanese invasion and ends up in a prison camp for civilians and U.S. military in China.
But Steve, that's a world-class movie. I mean,
it's a world-class movie, but people don't talk about it. I feel like it's underrated in terms of people.
Well, I don't think it was successful. I don't think it was successful at all.
It was released the same year as The Last Emperor, which won the Best Picture that year, and I think it got lost in the transition. Arthur, I'm saying it's a great movie.
I agree.
Film movie. The imagery is very interesting because there's been 2,000 World War II movies, but there have only been a handful of movies that are set in occupied China. And I thought it was a fascinating look. John Malkovich plays the leader of some American prisoners of war who befriend the character, the Jamie character played by Bale. And Bale is great. I mean, at first, he's a little insufferable as this kind of a stuck-up kid, but he becomes a hero.
Well, you talked about Spielberg, and we'll also like to talk about Scorsese, because he made a movie that was with De Niro, not a gangster movie, called The King of Comedy.
Oh,
really interesting, good movie that sadly did no business, but really was terrific. I had a wonderful time watching it. I think his name was Rupert Pumpkin or something like that.
Pupkin.
Rupert.
Jerry Lewis's best by far film of all time.
It is. Jerry was awesome being the Johnny Carson type character in it.
Yeah.
That's a great film. Got a film to talk about, guys. I would rate this movie as, in terms of an ensemble cast of great acting, I've never seen anything better than Glengarry Glen Ross. Not a monstrous hit at the box office. Well, what a quality piece. What acting. Al Pacino, Alec Baldwin,
Kevin Spacey, Alan Arkin,
Jack
Ed
Lemmon.
Harris.
But every one of these guys was like an Oscar performance. What a film. David Mamet. Jeepers. Julian, you had distribution rights to that after it went first run, right?
I did. I had it for the world, and I was very proud to distribute it. It's a terrific movie. And very rarely do you have a movie with no women in it. There wasn't a woman in that film.
Yeah.
And very, very rare. But boy, those guys, those acting, one better than the next. And it was
always raining, right, Jules?
Yeah. Well, David Mamet, who wrote it, worked in a real estate office. That's where he became familiar with the whole world of selling real estate. And he knew a lot about it, and the movie had great authenticity. I'll talk about another film that I don't know if you guys know. Richard Burton, Rex Harrison. Do you have any idea the movie?
No.
1969. They play a gay couple. It's called Staircase, is the name of the movie. 20th Century Fox. Got whacked all over because America 56 years ago had trouble with two very handsome men who are basically heterosexual playing gay men. A very interesting movie, and if I tell you the director, you'll really be surprised, Stanley Donen.
Oh.
So that's a film that it's an acquired taste. I liked it a lot. Yeah. I liked it a lot. The second film I want to talk about, which is kind of interesting to me, Woody Allen came out with Take the Money and Run and Bananas and Everything You Want to Know About Sex, and he was flying along with these great comedies, and he decided to make a very serious movie called Interiors. Well, the critics and public were outraged. How did he, great comic director and writer, is making this serious movie, and it absolutely died. But over the years, people who know film realized that this cast was unbelievable that he put together of some of the greatest female actresses together: Geraldine Page, Maureen Stapleton, Mary Beth Hurt, Diane Keaton, the guys E.G. Marshall, Sam Waterston, and the film has acquired a small but very dedicated audience and a whole reevaluation of that movie. I actually can say that I told Woody I was disappointed, but when I saw it recently, I was shocked at how good it was. And it showed, none of us knew then, that he was very capable for writing women's roles and has gone on to do so, including Cate Blanchett winning the award for Blue Jasmine.
Woody was a big fan of Ingmar Bergman's work, and that kind of showed in Interiors. Interesting aside on Interiors, he was looking for an executive-looking kind of guy to put into the film for some kind of a scene, not an important scene, but he's in the movie. So my brother was one of the top distribution execs at UA at the time, and he used Bob. So I see my brother when I see that film. I haven't seen it in quite some time, but you see him, and it was that was fun.
I think that when Woody, it was so funny in his first few films, off the charts funny, that when they say a Woody Allen movie is coming out without Woody Allen, you're immediately disappointed.
Yes,
that hurt that movie. I mean, I had no interest in seeing it because Woody wasn't in it, and I obviously missed what Julian has termed a very good movie. I have to say that it's been interesting over the years because obviously Woody isn't in his movies anymore. And although we've talked about Midnight in Paris, which is my favorite of his latter-day movies, and I thought Owen Wilson did a really nice job kind of playing a younger Woody Allen type character.
It's true. It's true.
How about this for an obscure film that had one of those titles called Cockleshell Heroes, a true World War II story in England, true World War II story, starring Jose Ferrer, and Anthony Newley's in the film. It's about a group of guys who come off of a submarine and get into kayaks, and they attack the Nazis in a pivotal point in their kayaks. Of course, that they figured out was the only thing that could get into this area. A good movie, though. Again, one of those quality things that just got lost. But if you were to watch it today, you'd like it. I guarantee you.
I would say that it's one step title-wise above Shawshank Redemption
and Kaleidoscope.
Well, that movie was produced by Albert R. Broccoli and Irving Allen. Broccoli, obviously, I shouldn't say obviously. Broccoli produced all the James Bond movies, the early Bond movies.
You ever see it, Steve?
I haven't seen it, but it was written by Richard Maybaum, who also wrote the James Bond movies. He wrote it with Brian Forbes. This was part of that period. I think, if I'm not mistaken, it was probably a Columbia film, because I think
it was.
Yeah, they had a deal with Columbia because there were all these frozen funds in Britain that the studios could utilize for picture making, if I'm not mistaken.
I think they had a
watch that movie, put it on tonight. You'll love it.
I think there was a subsidiary called Royal Films, and Royal Films was Columbia-Royal to take care of those, I think, frozen assets that were there.
I think they also had the EADY plan, EADY, yes, which was a subsidy. They subsidized American film shooting in England. So the Broccoli Irving partnership produced a lot of movies. They made a lot of movies with Alan Ladd. In fact, the other day when we were talking about Cockleshell, I confused it with a movie called The Red Beret, which was an Alan Ladd World War II movie. That's a good one. Now, another filmmaker we adore, and we've talked about him on many of our shows, is Billy Wilder. I mean, Billy Wilder's made some of the greatest movies of all time, but I would argue that his Sherlock Holmes movie, The Private Life of Sherlock Holmes, or The Private Lives of Sherlock Holmes from 1970, is very underrated. I think if you've seen it, or if you haven't seen it, it's kind of a soulful, romantic film in certain ways, with a wonderful Miklos Rozsa score. And Robert Stevens plays Sherlock Holmes. And it's interesting because Robert Stevens was not a big name for 1970. I'm wondering how many actors turned down the role before they gave it to Robert Stevens. But it's a very, very good mystery involving some World War I era espionage.
Robert Stevens was an important actor in England, and he was married to Dame Maggie Smith.
Oh, there you go. And I think his son, if I'm not mistaken,
Toby
is the lead in a Pierce Brosnan James Bond movie, of course.
Another espionage movie that is underrated. Great movie called The Eye of the Needle with Donald Sutherland.
Yeah.
What was the woman's name who was in that?
Kate. That pretty Kate.
Long Island. Kate Duggan or
Kate Nelligan.
Kate Nelligan.
Yes.
Give that man the Cupid ball.
Fantastic.
All I got was the Kate.
Terrific film.
Go on, Arthur.
I wouldn't put this again. I wouldn't put this clearly into the category of underrated because it was a hit, but it was in the 1960s. It came out. Great movie by Bobby Mulligan from the Bronx, Robert Mulligan. But it kind of came and it's gone and what have you. And it's a great film. And I call it underrated, called The Summer of 42.
Of course.
I had a big hit with it in New York.
I'll bet.
Big. That was big.
How about the theme song? How about the theme song?
Great.
Michel Legrand, very famous score, very romantic score. I played that LP for years. No, I'm a big fan of that movie, especially if you were coming of age during it, because that movie's all about coming of age.
Yeah.
Oh, yes.
The scene where he's got to walk into the small town drugstore and buy some rubbers is classic.
Yeah. And that was actually Mike Nichols did use that example with Dustin Hoffman when he was going to check into the hotel with Buck Henry as the clerk, the room clerk. And he wasn't doing it the way Mike wanted it to be done. And Mike said, "Do you remember ever having to buy a contraceptive?" And Dustin said, "Oh, yeah, it was awful. I was so embarrassed." And he said, "Do that."
Well, remember what Buck Henry's first line to him is as the clerk? Says, "Are you here for an affair?"
Yeah. That's right. Well,
Now, speaking of espionage, I'll mention a George Clooney movie, which I came across on cable TV, which I had not seen in the theaters, called The American. Are you guys familiar?
No.
It's a terrific movie, all set in Europe. George Clooney plays an assassin, a for-hire assassin, and it's a very gritty role for Clooney. Clooney's very selective in what he does, and some of his stuff I haven't cared for, but this is a very powerful movie. It's a very sexy movie. He gets involved with a number of women. I thought it was terrific. Mike, you've seen it, right?
Of course. It was an amazing film. And it's almost like a la James Bond in some ways, but not with the gadgets and such. But it's a true espionage movie. And he plays a suave, debonair type character. And it's a lot of fun. It is a lot of fun.
there's an emotional movie that I fell in love with that did no business called Dominic and Eugene.
Yes, nice movie. Loved it.
Beautiful film. Ray Liotta and Tom Holtz. Ray Liotta is an intern as a doctor. His twin is Tom Holtz, but Tom Holtz is very slow-witted and gets into trouble, and it's all about love and responsibility, and it's a beautiful film. And Robert Young directed it. Do you remember that?
I do.
Robert Young.
And it's a great example of what this subject is. Really, it is. That is an underrated film, basically forgotten. Again, if you see it today, it'll stand up.
It does. It does. It's a lovely movie. Bob Altman had a very, very erratic career as far as success in box office. He kept making movies because they kept hoping he'd have another MASH. But he did make a movie with Elliot Gould called The Long Goodbye. Very interesting movie based on the Philip Marlowe character. The detective Sterling Hayden is in it. And in one of the scenes, they go by in the beach, and there's a weightlifter. And the weightlifter is Arnold Schwarzenegger.
That's a very good movie.
And Elliot Gould must have smoked himself into COPD in that film.
Yeah.
Every scene he's smoking and smoking. I'm going to give you an example of a movie that's Nothing with Nothing. 1957, Columbia Pictures, black and white. Written, one of the writers was Blake Edwards. Talk about a little movie called Operation Mad Ball. In this movie is Ernie Kovacs, Jack Lemmon at the beginning. Mickey Rooney is in a scene that I would rate. In other words, if I would take the 10 funniest scenes in the history of movies, you'd put up Dr. Strangelove on the top for a scene. There are other scenes, maybe in Pink Panther, and there are other movies with great funny scenes. In this little nothing movie, which is enjoyable if you watch it, called Operation Mad Ball, Catherine Grant, before she married Bing Crosby, she was gorgeous. There's a scene with Mickey Rooney, who plays Dick York's cousin, Yancey Skibo. And I would put that, if not in the top, at the top of the top 10, it would be number 4, 5, or 6. 5-6 minutes of film, fantastic. Again, nobody ever heard of it, but I had seen it because it was screened at Columbia way back when.
Oh, I know it. I know the film.
You know the movie.
I do.
I guarantee you, if you watch the movie, it's nothing. It's a no brainer. But when it comes to that scene, you will find yourself laughing out loud.
That may be an interesting show one day, that we take the 10 or 7 or whatever funniest scenes that we've ever seen in movies. And if we could describe them without cracking ourselves up, it might be a good show.
One of those movies, Julian, would also be underrated, called My Favorite Year.
Oh, yes.
Had some of those scenes.
That's right. Oh, my God. Joe Bologna in that film is fantastic. Really terrific. Well, I mentioned Bob Altman. He also made a movie called McCabe and Mrs. Miller. McCabe and Mrs. Miller with Warren Beatty, Julie Christie. This film opened in New York and died. I mean, it died. It played 2 weeks and was thrown out of Lowe's theaters at the time. But Warren Beatty, as Arthur knows well, took Bonnie and Clyde, which initially did not do well, pushed Warner Brothers to a new ad campaign, and made Bonnie and Clyde that huge success it became. It was not initially a success at all, and was actually attacked by the major critics for the violence, especially the last scene, which has more bullets than any scene in history.
Blood.
When they're killed. But McCabe and Mrs. Miller was an interesting, gritty, tough movie that Altman made, and Warren tried again to do what he did with Bonnie. He did bring it back, but it never really made it. It's an interesting film, though.
There was another little movie that didn't work initially and became a big, big success. My partner and I were part of it in that we had states' rights distribution for New England, the 6 states in New England, called Billy Jack. You want to talk about a picture that did huge business in 1974, thereabout, 1975. It had died initially, and the Tom Laughlin, who was Billy Jack and who owned the rights to the movie, sued Warner Brothers for misdistributing the movie, which they did. They played it exclusively in big city after big city, and it just went away. And he had the idea of just putting all kinds of television advertising behind it. And it was a revenge movie, and it was the underdog and what have you. It just worked big time. Would I call it underrated? No, yeah, it wasn't a great movie, but it was, for what it was terrific. One movie I don't want to miss. Terrific movie, underrated, almost unknown, called The House of Games. David Mamet, Joe Montana,
I think Lindsay Krause.
Lindsay Krause.
Yeah.
And what, Rick Jason or something, the guys, the card dealer, Ricky Jay, the magician. Talk about a great movie. And nobody knows the movie. You know, it just came and went. But that thing stands up. Did you see it, Steve?
I have not seen it, and I definitely want to see it. I want to go back to 1951, which happened.
Oh, we all do, Steve.
Yes, Bobby Thompson.
Bobby Thompson, and I saw, not that I saw it then, because I wasn't seeing much in 51 other than never mind what I was saying. Storm Warning, 1951. Richard Brooks wrote it. Stuart Heisler directed it. Ginger Rogers plays a fashion model who goes down south to see her sister, played by Doris Day, who's married to Steve Cochran. And Ginger arrives at the train station. All of a sudden, everybody's clearing out. The lights are going off. She barely has time to check her luggage. She's walking down the street. All of a sudden, a bunch of guys wearing white hoods are coming out of the police station, dragging a guy. And one guy shoots him, and he falls down dead. Now, Ginger Rogers is inside a screen door, seeing everything. And then she starts to run. Nobody sees her. She finds her sister. And by the way, when the guys shoot the guy, 2 of them remove their hoods. So she goes to find her sister, tells her what's going on, tells her they had hoods, etc. And then she goes home to meet her sister's husband, played by Steve Cochran. He's one of the killers. So that's the setup for Storm Warning. The county prosecutor is played by Ronald Reagan. And he is terrific. And it's a movie all about the Klan and how it has the sway over this small town in the South. Really interesting movie. It's called Storm Warning.
Wow, talk about movies that are underrated. We tried watching the other night a movie called The Crowded Sky, which came in at that point of The High and the Mighty and that whole genre.
Ephraim Zimbalist Jr.?
Yes. All I can say about this as an underrated movie, it is the most overrated movie I've ever seen. This is so bad. I don't know what to say about it. I mean, you got to watch it to believe it. You know.
Well, Arthur, you
Troy Donahue.
You know the Coen brothers, and you've worked with them and gotten involved with them. But they made a movie that became a real cult film, but it died initially, I believe, and that was The Big Lebowski. Don't think it did business until a while went by, and the dude,
great word of mouth.
Jeff Bridges, the dude became a cult figure, no question. And
a guy walked up to me one day, Julian. I'm in LA. A guy walked up to me and said, "Hey, Arthur, my name is Mike, whatever the hell his name was, Jeff something. I'm the dude." And boy, big.
He was the man.
He was the dude.
And John Goodman was in it. It was a very interesting film.
Well, and still does business. I'm telling you that picture plays all the time.
I'm sure it's true. So it's interesting how some of these movies, it takes a while, but eventually the public catches up. And sometimes, as we've said, they do not.
I'd like to mention a comedy from 2005, Reese Witherspoon and Mark Ruffalo in a movie called Just Like Heaven. And it's a really interesting premise. Basically, Reese Witherspoon is a successful emergency room doctor, and she gets into a traffic accident and goes into a coma, and she's in the hospital, but her body is in the hospital, but her image, almost like a ghost, starts to appear in her old apartment, which has been abandoned and has been now rented by Mark Ruffalo. So he sees her, and it starts a relationship. It's a very, very, very interesting movie with terrific charisma between Reese and Mark Ruffalo. It's definitely worth your time. It has a lot of funny comic moments. The guy who was in Napoleon Dynamite, which of course was a big comedy hit out of Sundance, he's in it. He plays a mystic. It's a fun movie.
Worth mentioning, Mark Ruffalo, great career, terrific actor, likability. He's like a star is he a star? He's not box office, but he certainly has worked all the time and is great in everything he does.
What was that film? What was the name of that film, Steve? I want to see it. Reese and Mark, what's the name?
Just Like Heaven, 2005.
Oh, it's kind of like our show.
It's just like heaven. And Ruffalo is wonderful. I was just watching him the other night in 13 Going on 30 with Jennifer Garner, and that is also a very fun movie that I wouldn't put it in an underrated, but definitely a fun movie.
We had a little art film at United Artists called Shame, Shame, which was Ingmar Bergman. All the theaters downtown Boston were owned by one guy. It was a monopoly. And there was a woman who owned the art theater. So we, every now and then, United Artists had, like every company, had to give her a movie so she wouldn't sue. So it was kind of like an art theater. She played the Big Chill. She did very well with it. Endless Summer. Anyway, I'm called by my boss, and he says, "Go over." And she's very elegant. She's British, and she has a sister, and her sister sits in the back when you talk to her. But you got to be a gentleman and offer her Shame. And I said, "Of course, I'll be happy to do it." I go over to the Exeter Theater on Newbury Street, and she's wonderful. She opened. It was a church on Sundays, but it was a movie theater, and they operated as a movie theater. Played only the best films. "Oh, hello! It's nice to see you, sir, from United Artists." I go sit down with her, and I see a vision of another woman sitting 12 rows behind us. That was her sister. It was like kind of a strange meeting. And I'm saying, well, we at United Artists are very proud to be able to offer you, and we look forward to your playing the new Ingmar Bergman film, Shame. To which she said, "Skammen." And I said, "God bless you." Skammen. I'm looking at my sheet. No, it's Shame. Skammen, young man, you must get the. Well, that was a Swedish title. Another, you look at Ingmar Bergman's films, there it is. So she played Skammen, we played it as Shame. But as I understand it, for Bergman films, it's kind of like an underrated movie.
Shame on you, Arthur.
Never been able to sit through a Bergman film. Yeah.
Anyway, we've come to the end of our show. We've had a delightful time talking about a lot of movies today, and I think we barely scraped the surface. In fact, I think we could probably do Underrating Part 2 next year. Right, Julian?
Absolutely. And we can scrape as good as anyone.
Yes.
Let's turn over the stage to the estimable, or however you say it, Mike Faber.
Boy, talk about scraping the bottom there, Steve.
Like underrated.
Oh, exactly.
Shame.
End of this episode of the Tales from Hollywoodland podcast. Always remember, we couldn't do this here without you. We want to hear from you, so please write us anytime at talesfromhollywoodland@gmail.com. Remember, you can also find us wherever fine podcasts are found, and now you can even find us up on YouTube. If you made it this far into the episode, why not subscribe and give us a thumbs up? Or if you're listening to us, please give us 5 stars and subscribe. If you're into social media, please check us out on Instagram and Facebook. Before we get out of here, let's check with the guys and see what's happening this week on their podcast. Julian, who are we talking to this week?
Part 2 of John Badham, a wonderful director who did War Games and Saturday Night Fever and Birds on a Wire, a lot of pictures, but he's a guy who started in the mailroom, then went into casting, started doing television, and finally made the big move to motion pictures. Quite an interesting man who teaches in California, and I think you'll enjoy listening to him.
Most definitely. Steve, now that you're back from Hawaii, what's cooking on Saturday night at the movies?
We'd love to say we're doing Hawaiian movies, but no, we are actually doing our interview with Tom Schulman, the award-winning writer of the Dead Poets Society, Honey, I Shrunk the Kids, What About Bob? We get into all sorts of things about what makes a good feature comedy. I'm having a lot of fun. And then coming up in a couple of weeks, we're going to do our Charlton Heston night, where we're going to talk about the great films and the great actor Charlton Heston.
Awesome. Coming up next week on the podcast.
Yeah, next week we're going to have Judd Newborn on, who runs the Center for Film on Long Island, has had some of the biggest names in show business, but he's also a Holocaust expert who has been involved in actually hunting down Nazis. So we will have a very interesting man next time, and maybe Arthur can talk to him about some of the Nazi movies that he doesn't like.
On behalf of Steve, Arthur, and Julian, thanks for listening. This is your producer and announcer, Mike Faber. We'll see you here next time on Tales from Hollywoodland. Your Hollywood adventure starts right here.
Enterprise Splaining is a podcast where we talk about Star Trek Enterprise. We are Trek experts.
You're aware that none of us have watched Enterprise before, right? We have whatever is the opposite of knowledge.
Oh, and it's not a normal rewatch podcast. Each week, only one of us watches the episode, and then we explain it to the others who haven't seen it.
That means you don't actually have to watch the episodes we're talking about, because we'll explain it all for you.
Oh yeah, we would never actually make anyone watch Enterprise.
Enterprise Splaining, the podcast where we explain Star Trek Enterprise to each other and to you.
This has been a broadcast of the ESO Network. Be part of the crew and help support our shows by donating to our ESO Patreon or by shopping at the TeePublic store, which can all be found at www.esonetwork.com. The ESO Network, your station for all things geek.